This is Undaunted.Life, a man's podcast. I'm your host, Kyle Thompson. Let's get into it. All right, guys, we've got a special return guest on the podcast today. His name is Justin Brierley. So he's the former host of the Unbelievable radio show and podcast on Premier Christian Radio in the UK. And he's authored several books. One of the books we named the Book of the Year a couple of years back. So it's The Surprising Rebirth of Belief in God, Why New Atheism Grew Old and Secular Thinkers Are Considering Christianity Again. And we're talking today a lot about his new book, which is Why I'm Still a Christian After 2 Decades of Conversations with Skeptics and Atheists, The Reason I Believe, which is actually a re-release of an old book called Unbelievable. And this guy's been on the podcast a bunch. He's been on, this is his 5th appearance. So he was on 543, 498, 322, and all the way back on 189. So we're very, very thrilled to have him here to talk to the audience. But in this particular podcast, we talk at the beginning about really the surprising rebirth of Christianity. This question I've been posing to a lot of people about, are we about to see a big time awakening? Then we talk about faith in the UK. He gave me an absolutely mind-blowing stat there at the beginning of the podcast about what faith is doing and how that's looking in the UK and kind of the direction that's going. But then we also talked about, the issues they're having in the UK with Islam, with a lot of the Muslims that have immigrated to that country, some legally, some not, and how they've not assimilated to the Western culture and how that's causing a lot of issues there. But then throughout this conversation, we do dig into a lot of other things. We talk about kind of this incongruity that's growing between these secular atheist women, highly college-educated women, and then these men that are being drawn more back towards the faith, but are a little bit more blue-collar, perhaps not going to college, and some of the issues that that's creating. But then we get into the actual book. We talk about, okay, you're taking off your moderator hat and then you're putting on your Christian Apologist hat. How are you able to go back and forth with those different things? But then we get into, okay, what are atheists doing when they're trying to find quote unquote meaning in the world? Like, how are they able to do that? Okay, what about when atheists bring up the problem of evil, the problem of human suffering? Like, how do people respond to that? But then also just they're trying to dispense with this Jesus person as if he didn't even exist in history. But even if they acknowledge that he existed in history, okay, they want to turn him into something else. So not Jesus the Savior, more like Jesus the Guru or Jesus the person in my own image, not in the image of God type of a thing. And then we talk towards the end about deconstruction and reconstruction, how that's caused some issues because a lot of people will deconstruct their faith with no intentions of actually reconstructing it. We get into some of the stuff that he's going to be working on for the very near future. But as always, I really, really enjoy my time with Justin, so I'm not going to keep him from you any longer. So without further ado, let's get into it. Justin Brierley, I got to tell you right from the beginning here, okay? There are very few things and very few people on this planet that I would not only wake up early for, but miss my workout for. Wow. And that's for you, Justin Brierley, because it is early here in the United States of America. And normally if I'm up this early, it's because there are weights that need to be moved. Do you feel loved? Because you should.
I do.
Should feel very loved.
I feel so honored that you have skipped your regular regime in order to make this particular time of the day here in the UK with me. Thank you, Kyle.
And I think it's because I'm feeling like extra celebratory because this is your 5th appearance on Undaunted.Life, a man's podcast. Now, there are restaurants where if you buy like 4 sub sandwiches, you get the 5th one free, or you get 4 slushies, you get the 5th one free. But I feel like what struck me this morning is this is bingo, right? Because in bingo, you got to get 5 in a row or whatever. And so I've got a celebratory tea, which feels very appropriate, considering I'm talking to an Englishman, to you as well. Cheers. But man, 5 appearances on the show. What's wrong with you? Like you couldn't get it all out in the first 4?
I don't know. You keep very kindly inviting me back. Is this unusual for you to have a guest on this many times on the show?
I think, aside from the people that we have on every month, I think it's like you and John Eldridge, I think have been on here like 5 times. Maybe John's been on 6, or Holly McKay's been on a bunch of times too. But yeah, this is rare air that you're in right now.
I feel absolutely, not only have you foregone your normal training regime, I'm in the company of some amazing people there. So thank you so much.
You are. I am weaker, but my audience is better for it. So let's go ahead and launch in. And I guess what we need to do from the beginning is because, again, the first time you're on the show, you were still doing the Unbelievable podcast. You have since no longer been doing the Unbelievable podcast. You've been doing some other things. Obviously, we're going to get into your new old book here in just a second. But what in the world are you doing now? I'm sure you're gainfully employed making content. So what are you doing?
I am keeping myself busy. So since moving on from the Unbelievable show, a big focus of my time has been something called the Surprising Rebirth of Belief in God. And I'm pretty sure that's what I came on last time to talk about,
That's right.
the book and the
You
podcast
came on last
series.
time because you were the book of the year for that year.
That's
and so
right.
we snuck you back onto the show for it.
Yeah, well, thank you so much. It was so kind of you to have me on. But the Surprising Rebirth of Belief in God, just for those who maybe don't recall the last conversation, is my thesis that we're seeing a renewal of interest in Christian faith in the West after a long period in which the new atheists kind of dominated the scene. I think we're starting to see the growth of a new conversation on faith from secular intellectuals like Jordan Peterson, Tom Holland, Ayaan Hirsi Ali, and others who are kind of like creating this really interesting wave of new interest in the value of faith. And I think we're starting to see that represented now in the way that, just Gen Z are becoming more and more interested in spiritual matters, taking faith seriously. There's some extraordinary statistics coming out about the return, especially of young men to church, which are obviously interesting for this podcast. So yeah, I'm quite interested and galvanized, hopeful, optimistic. And so I've been trying to just chart that really, both through the book that came out, 18 months ago, but also the ongoing podcast documentary series, The Surprising Rebirth of Belief in God.
Well, with everything that you've put your hands on, and obviously I know I joke around a lot, but this is, full sincerity here. You do a fantastic job. You're obviously, you think through the things before you present them. And I'm still always, when I think of an example of being a true middleman of a conversation, I always think of Unbelievable first because of how you comported yourself during a lot of those debates. Some of them were just obnoxious, not because of you, but especially the person that had more the atheistic view. It's like, these are just terrible people. It's like, I don't understand why you're not just ganging up on these individuals, but it's because you're a lot nicer than I am. But I do want to ask you, it's a derivative of what you just described, but I've been asking a lot of people. I asked John Eldridge this. I've asked a lot of people recently on the show about this. But it does seem like you're calling it a rebirth, but it seems like there's a coming capital A awakening. So we had the Asbury quote unquote revival a couple of years back. It felt like to me, it was just like an artificially long worship service, but hey, I wasn't there. What can I say? But you do mention Ayaan Hirsi Ali. You mentioned Jordan Peterson. You mentioned Richard Dawkins saying he's at least a cultural Christian. You have Wes Huff going on the Joe Rogan Experience, and in an instant, he became the most famous Christian apologist alive today because of the wide berth that he's given by Joe Rogan's fame and how huge the Joe Rogan Experience is. And yes, Bible sales soaring. Young men saying, man, Andrew Tate's a freaking loser. Like, I don't want to listen to this guy. He doesn't have anything for me. Let's see what the Bible has to say. You say rebirth. I say potential awakening. What say you to that?
Yeah, I think that's exactly what we're looking at. I think they're two different descriptions of the same thing. I think the young men piece is particularly interesting, and it's just something that I was noticing even when I wrote the book, that obviously a lot of the people being attracted to these new secular intellectuals talking about the value of faith, people like Peterson and others, have been a lot of young men, undoubtedly. And I think that's because, and I think you've identified this as well, Kyle, there's been a kind of male identity crisis brewing in the West for a long time. And young men especially just don't know who they're supposed to be. They get all these confusing messages from the culture. And the problem is the kind of secular humanist narrative just failed to deliver any answers. And so they've been looking for a kind of role models, basically. Now, sadly, as you say, some of them are really bad. They run into the Andrew Tates and his vision of this kind of misogynistic, whoever sleeps with the most women kind of version of reality is just the most awful thing. It's a kind of pagan, a pre-Christian, really, view of power. And men and women. But then I think there have been some positive role models, people like Jordan Peterson, who have kind of, whatever you think of where he lands on the God question, he's certainly been opening the door to a lot of young men. I've met a lot of them who have come to faith, who have taken Christianity seriously because of him. So I'm thankful for him for that reason. And so, yeah, I think it's really interesting now that we are seeing these first signs, showing up in the surveys, in the polls, that young men are starting to actually return to church. Now, in the US, I saw that statistic showing that Gen Z men have overtaken women for the first time in terms of church attendance, which is pretty extraordinary. Here in the UK, we're about to have, at the time of recording, some extraordinary data released, which this may be the first time your audience are hearing about this, but the Bible Society UK have been kind of tracking church going for a long time in the UK. They last did a polls in 2018. At that point, really big sample survey, very small proportion of young people going to church, only 4% of young men said they went to church regularly. They just did a new survey last year. It's more than quadrupled the number of young men saying, and no one was expecting that. Nobody was expecting that. But it just tallies with so much other data I'm hearing in other parts of Europe. You've had Norway, you've had Finland, you've had Sweden, all reporting rises in young people, but especially young men starting to go to church. You've had these stories of booms in the Eastern Orthodox Church, in traditional Catholicism. Again, it's young people generally, but especially the young men seem to be coming back. And I think it's because, exactly as you said, they're looking for a better story. And they've realized there's a better story than the Andrew Tates. There's a better story than the kind of liberal secular culture is offering me. And it's the original story. It's the Christian story.
Well, I was going to ask you about the faith numbers in the UK, but that is an absolutely stunning revelation that we're coming. I wonder, I don't want to dig too far into it because you don't like getting into topics that are too prickly, but with the rise of a lot of Muslims coming into the UK and some of the issues that have been happening, at least on a street level, in terms of the non-assimilation of certain cultures into another culture, perhaps has something to do with it, but
I don't mind prickly topics, honestly.
Well, let's dig into that a little bit, because over here, I seem to only be getting the bad stories of non-assimilation and, what is it? The rape gangs and things like
absolutely.
that.
I mean, and I come across this a lot with my US friends. I think there's truth there. Obviously, there are some serious issues with the way that the kind of multicultural project has not worked out in large parts of the UK. Yeah. And absolutely, I would, there's this odd thing that happened where the Muslim rape gang thing kind of happens. Like the main focus on that was a few years ago now, but it kind of came back into the public sphere, especially in the US when Elon Musk started tweeting about it. Now, the reality is things were done. People ended up in prison. So it's not that, this is just a crisis that got completely swept under the carpet or anything like that. But nonetheless, at the time, the reason why justice took so long to be done for a number of the girls who were being groomed and trafficked and raped in these awful gangs was because there was a kind of political correctness where the authorities did not want to rock the boat and they didn't want to appear to be Islamophobic and everything else. But what that did was it just fueled massive tensions within those often working class communities where the people on the ground could see exactly who the people were who were doing this stuff. And that is what has led to the unrest we saw last year, after the Southport murder, of that tragedy of those young girls getting killed. Whatever you make of the rights and wrongs of what happened on the streets as people came out to protest and so on, it's partly because the government has failed to adequately address the concerns of a lot of people in the country. So I think there's a problem. Absolutely. Now, it may not be as bad sometimes as some of the press makes out. When I walk down the street in London, I'm not living in Londonistan or whatever. It's not as bad as they claim sometimes. But nevertheless, there's still absolutely a problem. And fundamentally, I'm happy to say that I do not think Islam, especially as practiced by a lot of Muslims, is as culturally compatible, obviously, as Christianity, as the faith that our civilization was founded on. That shouldn't be a controversial thing to say in a way, but sadly, there are just going to be instances where you see that coming to light in really visceral ways, and those Muslim rape gangs have been one of the most awful manifestations of seeing that.
Well, I think you're right, and I appreciate you giving some detail on that from the ground, because something that I thought about, and I even taught Sunday school last weekend, and it's kind of funny. The running joke is when our Sunday school class gets a little bit too big, they make sure I come in and speak, because I always speak on the prickly topics, and it's just like, hey, we've got to think intellectually about these things. We got to be intellectually consistent, whether I'm talking about abortion or talking about different things. But I talked about Christian persecution. I talked about the 70 Christians that were beheaded in the Congo by Muslim fundamentalists. I talked about the ongoing crisis in Syria, where all Christian minorities, so Alawites, Druze, Kurds, and especially Christians, are being targeted by HTS and al-Jawlani and the new regime there that, took the place of another terrible regime. with Assad. But there is a fundamental incompatibility with Islam, Sharia law, and the West writ large. And it felt like Matt Chandler was at the Acts 29 conference last year, and he talked about how people treat their own sin. They treat their sin like a baby lion. Like a baby lion, so cute and cuddly, and it might cut your finger because the teeth are still kind of sharp, but it's just cute and cuddly. But you keep feeding it and caring for it and feeding it and caring for it, and one day it is reminded that it's an apex predator, and then it consumes you. And that's what it kind of feels like has been happening in, the UK. It's been happening in Scotland, in Ireland. I don't recognize what's happening in Ireland. You look at people are saying within the next 30 to 40 years, Ireland will be Irish people will be the minority in Ireland, right? Within the next 30 to 40 years. We see what's happening in Canada, and usually the worst parts of Canada are flushed down into California and then spread out over the rest of America, is seemingly how it goes. But again, aside from people being scared of being called Islamophobic, which if you want to call me a name, Islamophobic, racist, bigoted, whatever, like, I think that's cute. It's like, okay, what makes you think I would care what you think of me? Like, I'm not beholden to you. But gosh, there's a fundamental difference here that I think we need to talk about more, especially Christians need to stop kind of tut-tutting Islam and realize that it is a demonic false religion, that if you follow it and you believe in that, you don't go to heaven. Like you don't believe in Jesus as deity. You know what I mean?
And I think we need to be absolutely upfront and honest that all religions are not the same. Not all religions have the same, obviously, beliefs for starters, but have the same cultural outworking. And, someone who's been very clear on this is Ayaan Hirsi Ali, who we mentioned earlier, who has, her own story, if you like, of rejecting Islam because she grew up, in a fundamentalist branch of it under the Muslim Brotherhood in Somalia, and thinking, and kind of because of that, kind of rejecting religion as a whole, was the most famous female atheist in the world for a number of years, alongside Dawkins, Harris and co. But then, of course, in the last couple of years, becoming a Christian because she realized, not all religions are the same. There's a fundamental difference between Christianity and Islam when it comes to the conception of who God is. And she came to realize that actually all the things she enjoyed about Western culture were essentially products of the Christian Revolution. So I'm not going to sort of disagree with you that there are major differences both in the religion itself and the outworkings of that religion. Now, having said all that, where I would just push back a little bit is that I think some of the solutions that are being offered are not good either. So I don't want people embracing Islam, but I don't want them embracing the far right either. And there is a significant problem there because neither of these are Christian alternatives. And my only worry is when I see certain far right types kind of effectively doing a kind of demonization of Islam, kind of putting all the ills of society on one group of people. I think, no, that isn't the Christ-like thing to do either. We've got to find the Christ-like answer to this, which is calling people to the vision of Jesus, and that has to transcend kind of these kind of sub-Christian kind of ways of trying to answer this problem.
Well, that's actually a very interesting topic. Eventually, we will get to the book, but this is all very interesting to start out. So you say far right. I don't know what you mean in terms of how the UK views far right, because if I were to say far right, what I don't mean is someone who voted for Trump, and what I don't mean is someone who is very conservative, because I'm a very conservative person that voted for Trump for president.
So we're on the same page.
So what I mean are like accelerationists, which I just had a guy on who was a 28-year FBI undercover guy. He infiltrated the KKK, biker gangs, accelerationist, white supremacist groups that would vote for anybody that would lead to the destruction of society so that it can be rebuilt in the image of the great white man. And I'm like, yeah, whatever that is, you lunatics stay out there in the bushes. I don't want y'all anywhere near the levers of power. So it's similar when you say far right.
Yeah, I exactly. And I think there are genuinely far right parties, parties like the AfD in Germany, which are, to all intents and purposes kind of have very much neo-Nazi kind of leanings, The problem is that we're at a time when people are more prepared to listen to those. And it's because of the failings on the left. I think the reason for the rise of that type of far right is precisely because the left pushed its agenda so far and didn't adequately. And so people kind of get pushed to the other extreme. So, and the problem is, as Christians, we've got to be very wary and wise about not simply surrendering to either extreme, but saying, no, Jesus calls us to something better. So I think that's just my danger. The thing that I want to kind of point out is that I share a lot of the concerns that you're talking about here, but it's so easy for Christians sometimes to be captured by, when I see kind of some of the vile stuff going around on X, purportedly from Christians, that's just pure anti-Semitic, purely racist, I just think, no, something's captured so many people and they're just being dragged to the other extreme, and that's not going to help anyone either.
Hey guys, real quick, I know a lot of you guys struggle with getting a consistent workout routine. So wherever you get to, whether that's the Globo gym or your home gym or even like a parking lot somewhere, you get there and then you don't know what to do. You get there and you're just like, well, what in the world am I supposed to do today? And you just kind of meander around, and maybe you're trying to get ready for like a mountain hunt in the fall, or you've got a mud race coming up, or you just want to be generally a strong and fit dude for normal everyday life, but you don't have a program that's tailored for you. I want you guys to stop wasting time at the gym or wherever you're working out and just settling for that same old routine that you've always done. It's time for you to get a guide that will help you reach your fitness goals. And that's why I want to introduce you to my friends over at Mountain Tough. Mountain Tough is a fitness and mental toughness app developed by military special operators and mountain hunters that's becoming a global movement for building mentally tough athletes on and off the mountain. So Mountain Tough is a native app ready to be downloaded on all platforms. So that includes iPhone, Android, Apple TV, and Roku. Once you sign up and download the app or access the website, you immediately have access to literally hundreds of exercise programs and thousands of workout videos. Thousands, okay? That includes structured hybrid strength and endurance programs, daily workouts, the full exercise library, mental toughness training, prehab and rehab, the Mountain Tough community and accountability, and a bunch of other stuff. And guys, you can use it all on the go, online or offline, no matter where you decide to train. Just getting started? No problem. They've got programs for beginners. Have minimal gear or no gear? All good. They have minimal gear and bodyweight programs. Wanting to get into or maintain elite level fitness like me? They've got you covered with programs for top tier athletes too. And guys, for a limited time, Mountain Tough is extending Undaunted Lifers like you an incredible offer. Go to mountaintough.com. That's MTNtough.com and enter the code Kyle when you sign up for a monthly plan to receive your first month free after your 14-day free trial. So for guys that aren't good at math, that is 6 weeks free to make sure this app is for you, and I'm sure it will be. That is 6 weeks free on the best-in-class physical and mental training app in the world. Stop wasting time. It's time to get real fitness results and let my friends at Mountain Tough guide the way. Again, go to MTN Tough. That's mountaintough.com, promo code Kyle. When it goes back to something we were talking about earlier, so I do want to circle back to the people. I feel like Andrew Tate is kind of the extreme version. So I think Ben Shapiro had probably the best take on Andrew Tate, which is he's great at describing a problem, but his prescriptions are horrible, right? And so because he's kind of playing a character in a way. I think Andrew Tate created this persona and it kind of overtook him, right? It was his own little personal line, this Andrew Tate character, the glasses and the pimping. And then he started actually doing those things. And it's like, oh, he's actually just a terrible person that's devoid of any type of moral code. But you have young men that try the super pimp, sex with everybody, side, and that's vapid. And then they also have tried the incel thing, involuntary celibate, where they're just going to, sit around with their friends and they just hate women and they hate the government and blah, blah, that type of thing. Well, that's not very fruitful either. But then what we've seen in America, I don't know if you've seen these statistics, the breakdown of the Kamala Harris versus Donald Trump election in terms of who won what. Donald Trump did exceedingly well with Latinos, with black people, with college educated and non-college educated white men. Like he just won in all these different categories. But the number one category where he got absolutely trounced was college educated white women. So liberal, left-leaning women. And we're talking, I think it was like 30-point gap or something there. And so, Justin, there's this thing where it's way more women in college than men. Women don't want to marry down, right? Men will marry down if you think of this in, a clinical psychologist type of a way or a sociological type of way. So you have these women that are chasing the career and chasing the corner office and chasing the business and all those different things. And they're looking out on the dating pool and it's a bunch of just, it's more blue collar type guys that just want to make a good living and maybe they didn't finish college or something like that. And so it's causing more of these women to, to use the pejorative, to become cat ladies. They're just going to, I've heard of women getting their tubes tied because they're like, I don't want to get impregnated by any one of these losers, but I definitely want to have as much random sex as possible because that's somehow liberating. And I feel like we're running into an issue to where hopefully these young men that are coming back to faith, I don't know, can convince the majority of women in the population that, hey, what you're doing is it's not going to be beneficial for you in the long run. I just don't know how to counsel these young men, aside from, hey, if you brush your teeth and show up to your job on time, you're about 10 miles ahead of some of your peers. You know what I mean?
I mean, my hope, honestly, Kyle, is that both men and women will find Jesus because, I'm really glad about the men who are coming back to faith and finding that, there's way more to life than the Andrew Tate version, and who are starting to kind of dig deep, if you like. That may be coming back to more conservative values around life and so on. And that the polls have been showing this massive divergence between young men and young women when it comes to their political values and so on. Young women remaining very progressive, young men veering more conservative. Now the question is, will women follow suit? Okay, what would it take in a sense for that to happen? I'm not sure. What I'm not that interested in, I suppose, is just a purely conservative project thing, though. I want people to come to Christ, and that's got to happen across both men and women. If women, in those kind of secular elites are essentially looking down on men and saying, I don't want to be with a man if he holds those values or whatever, then that's not good either, because, that is essentially someone who's living under a certain form of idolatry, just as men who are, captivated by, Tate can, be idolatrous in their own way. We all need Jesus, basically, is what I'm saying. And my hope is that whatever this swing back towards faith is among young men, it shouldn't be at the expense of women. It's because the vision that Jesus gives us is of men and women flourishing together. Jesus was an absolute inspiration to those male disciples, but he was also incredible. He broke down the barriers that existed between men and women as well in all kinds of phenomenal ways. He allowed women to become truly who they're supposed to be in him. So for me, it can't be about splitting them. It can't be some false dichotomy between men and women. It's got to be both together.
All right, very good. Well, I think we've waxed poetic about enough other subjects. We need to get into the point of today's call or today's interview, because you have a new book out. It's called Why I'm Still a Christian. I don't have it in front of me, so you're going to have to wave it in front of the camera. Boom, there it is. Why I'm Still a Christian After 2 decades of conversations with skeptics and atheists, the reason I believe. So this is a revised and updated edition of your 2017 book called Unbelievable. And so I believe we had you back on to talk about that book, I think, back in 2017 or 2018. So why the revised edition? Why the updated edition? Why now?
Well, I just think that we're more in need than ever of a confident case for faith, because in a way, the Surprising Rebirth book was kind of laying out this thesis that people are waking up to the value of faith again. But when they do that, they're going to have all kinds of questions. They're going to come with all of their objections potentially that they heard about Christianity. But I think we're living in this moment where we've got an incredible opportunity to share faith with people who perhaps haven't taken it seriously up till now. So really what I've tried to do with the new book, Why I'm Still a Christian, is just to kind of explain why I'm still a Christian. Because I have spent, the best part of 20 years now hosting dialogues between atheists and skeptics, hearing from both sides of the table. And I came out of that actually more convinced, more confident in the Christian faith than I was when I began. That's not to say there aren't any questions or mysteries and all the rest of it. But what I discovered was when you put Christianity next to any other worldview, be it atheism, Islam, Buddhism, whatever, it actually stands up intellectually. It's a more coherent, more compelling vision of reality for all kinds of reasons. And so I tried to kind of distill some of the core reasons why I think Christianity makes sense, why I'm still a Christian, and help people answer some of those common objections, like the problem of suffering, what about hell, all of those kinds of issues. I've tried to do that in a book that's readable, that's based on a lot of the stories, the interactions I've had with guests on both sides of the table over the years, and hopefully the kind of thing that can give a Christian a sense of confidence in their faith, but they could also give to a friend who's asking about faith and maybe might help them on their journey as well.
Well, so let's actually talk about that, because this is you in a way, at least maybe to the audience. You're taking off your moderator hat, you're setting that down, and you're putting on the apologist hat. And so talk a little bit about that, because those are like two different muscles. That's not just like, hey, I'm going to turn it up a little bit here and turn it down a little bit there. It's like two different things entirely.
Absolutely. And for years, I have been that moderator in the middle of the Christian and the atheist going at it. And one of the most frequent comments I had from people when I was hosting those shows was, very often non-Christians who started listening. They said, well, for a few weeks I listened and I couldn't actually tell where you stood, Justin. I wasn't sure if you were even a Christian. Now, obviously, I am a Christian. But I think it was important whenever I do, and I continue to host, discussions and debates, it's important actually to be a kind of as neutral as you can be, so that you can just let the guests do the talking and bring out the best from both sides. I think that's to respect, and to bring out the best from both people. But, at the point where people started asking me, well, why are you still a Christian after all these years of talking with some of the best known atheists in the world, sitting down with Dawkins and Steven Pinker and Daniel Dennett, and I thought, well, actually, maybe it is time to put it all down in a book form. And that is very different, because as you say, you're no longer in neutral mode. You're in making the case persuasion mode. And that's what I'm doing very consciously here. And it's been kind of fun, I'll admit, because increasingly in the last few years, I've much more sat more often in the seat of the Christian, often in debates, against people like the atheist YouTuber Alex O'Connor, or opposite, other people, Rationality Rules, another well-known atheist YouTuber. And it's been very different being the person making the case from being the neutral moderator. I've kind of enjoyed it. It puts me on the spot, and I think I've learned some of the best ways of doing that from being in the moderator seat. So it's quite a different experience, though.
It's funny, because as I was reading through the book, I'm like, okay, how good would I be at doing the opposite? So how good would I be at becoming the neutral moderator? And I would be atrocious. I feel like I would be terrible, because I'm an intellectually honest guy, but I'm obviously really passionate. I don't mind a fight. And so it's like, let's get in there and kind of figure it out. But it seems like you can take the hat on and off pretty well. So I do want to get into some of the things in the book, and obviously we won't be going over everything in the book, but guys, the book is in the show notes. If you're listening to this on time, it is out now. Go into the show notes and you can pick up a copy of it. But the first thing I guess I want to talk about is, and this wasn't at the very beginning of your book, but it's atheists that are finding meaning in being an atheist, because that's something that's confusing. As a Christian, there's a lot of things that atheists think. They're just confused that Christians would believe in, X, Y, and Z, or X, Y, and Z to your UK audience. But, over here, I look at an atheist and I'm like, okay, so you think you're a highly evolved chimp that figured out, language, pants, and fire, and just you used to be a chimp and used to be goo, and then used to be like stardust before that. Like, okay, what is all this for then? Like, what is love to you? Like, why would you be altruistic? Like, why would you help an old lady across the street type of thing? But talk to me a little bit about what you've discovered and kind of where you've landed on atheists that are just desperately trying to find some sort of meaning in this world.
And one of the things I try to do throughout the book is to compare and contrast the atheist worldview, the naturalist worldview, against a Christian worldview. And I think this is one of the key areas where there's just a huge difference. And it's far harder, I think, on a purely atheist naturalist worldview to find meaning, to talk in realistic terms about purpose, about beauty, truth, right and wrong. All of those concepts, I think, kind of get dissolved by the naturalist, physicalist, materialist worldview, call it what you want. Because basically all you're dealing with in the end in that worldview is matter in motion, the physical forces of the universe, energy, space. That's the fundamental constituents of everything. So anything that comes out of that is just a kind of byproduct, really. It's not the core thing. And so when an atheist says, hey, I believe in meaning, I want to say, well, what do you mean by that? What kind of meaning do you have as an atheist? Because presumably you don't believe there's an overarching meaning to the universe. We weren't meant to be here. And they'll say, no, yeah, we're not meant to be here. We are kind of, in that sense, kind of accidental byproduct of kind of the forces of but what they often say to me, Kyle, is I can create my own meaning. Okay, I can sort of, have meaning with a small m rather than a capital M. This was, in fact, the way that sadly he passed away just last year. But the atheist philosopher Michael Roos often talked when I brought him on the show. He said, "I accept I can't have meaning with a capital M, Justin, but I can have this small m meaning." The problem is, and he was challenged on this really well by another Christian thinker called Andy Bannister, is that an atheist might be able to say, "Well, this is my personal meaning. Maybe it's to be kind to people, walk old ladies across the road, enjoy art, whatever." Okay, that's great. But what if another person says, that's great, that's your version of meaning. Well, my version of meaning is to ruthlessly get everything that I want in life and enslave, dominate. Okay. And there are people who can do that. The Genghis Khans of this world. Okay. That was their meaning. Okay. So how do you judge between your meaning and their meaning if we're all just basically holding on to our own little versions of meaning? And the problem is we can't. If there's no overarching meaning, then all you've got is a lot of stories that just disagree with each other. And in the end, what will happen is just whoever's the strongest will win out. Okay. And that has been the history of the world a lot of the time. So it's very difficult, I think, to hold on to a kind of any sense of an objective sense of meaning in the world if you don't believe in overarching meaning. And I think that's fundamentally where the atheist. So, and this is why so many atheists, this has been the turning point for them when they realized I can't have an objective belief even in something like right and wrong, morality. C.S. Lewis famously went from being an atheist to being a theist because he realized I can't talk about right and wrong without there being some objective standard of justice in the universe. Otherwise, it's just my personal opinions, and it's everyone's personal opinions. And he realized, but I do believe in right and wrong. I do believe in justice. So there must be a moral lawgiver. There must be a standard of justice beyond me. So that was the argument that took him and has actually taken a lot of the people to the point of believing in God. And I think it's a very powerful argument.
Well, and Justin, these people they seem to be slaves to objective facts. They're like, just give me the facts, give me the science. If I can't put God, in a beaker and heat him up with a Bunsen burner, then, I don't want to believe it. And it's like, okay, you only want to believe in certain categories of facts, right? And also categorically, they'll dispel with miracles, but it's like you believe in the ultimate miracle, which is that time, space, and matter had a timeless, spaceless, and immaterial beginning. What in the world are you talking about, right? And if there's a Big Bang, couldn't there be a Big Banger? Is that even possible? And then they don't really want to go there. But you mentioned C.S. Lewis, and we both share a tremendous fondness of C.S. Lewis. You have a quote from your book that he said. It's his words reminded me again of C.S. Lewis, who responded to the charge that belief in heaven is a form of escapism by saying, quote, "If you read history, you will find that the Christians who did most for the present world were just those who thought most of the next," unquote. And so that is one charge that you'll get from atheists is like, oh, well, because the atheists are the ones that care about the planet, right? The atheists are the ones that care about the least of these. But it's like performative empathy as opposed to legitimate sympathy, because you can be empathetic and not actually do anything. But if you're actually sympathetic, it's like, I feel bad for you and let's fix it, right? It's the meme that Doug Wilson brought up on my show recently where you have a husband and wife talking. The wife has like a cleaver in her head and she's like, I have this splitting headache. And her husband's like, honey, I'm so sorry you have a splitting headache. I really think if we got that cleaver out of your head that it would make you feel better. And she goes, I don't want to talk about the cleaver, right? It's like there's a difference between the performative empathy and then the actual sympathy. So talk to me a little bit about Christians and how we care for this world and the people in it versus atheists trying to find that as some meaning.
I think the key thing for me, and that quote you gave from C.S. Lewis about, it's precisely those who thought the most about the next world that made the most difference in this world, is kind of been brought out by, historians like Tom Holland, who I mentioned earlier, who've pointed out that atheist secular folk who maybe are doing a great job, they're really invested in morality and good causes and social justice and everything else. They're not doing that because of their atheism. Atheism itself really doesn't inspire anything. And in a way, arguably has even inspired some of the worst atrocities in the world. It's when people kind of completely abandon belief in God and the kind of belief in the sacredness of life that you often get the Pol Pots and the Stalins and those atheist regimes that really did just decide without God all things are possible. What happens though is that in my experience, when I do meet very moral, upright, upstanding atheists who say, well, I'm just here to care about the planet and I don't care about heaven or hell or anything else. I want to say to them, you didn't get those beliefs, that moral character from your atheism. You got it from Christianity. That's the reality. Is you are a very Christian atheist because you live in a fundamentally a culture, a Western culture that has been completely shaped by the Judeo-Christian story of reality. And this was something that, again, Douglas Murray, interesting sort of cultural critic, not a Christian, but who, when I've interviewed him on a couple of occasions, has always referred to himself to me as a Christian atheist because he gets it. He knows that his belief in dignity, morality, the way we should live our lives does not come from his atheism. It comes from the Christian culture in which he had grown up. Now, most atheists and secularists have kind of forgotten the founding story. And so they're still kind of running basically on the operating system without realizing that's fundamentally what drives their beliefs. And that's why C.S. Lewis says, if you're looking for the people who've done the most to create the kind of culture of freedom, prosperity, equality, human rights, go and look at the Christians. They're the ones who did it historically. They were the ones who created all the institutions because of their belief in a God of justice and human dignity and equality, because we're all made in the image of God. So that for me is really important. And the question is, can you hold on to that stuff if you lose the Christian story? I don't think you can. And I think that's what a lot of people like Tom Holland have been pointing out. And it's why, I'm all for my atheist friends being good people, but I want to kind of get them to pull on that thread a bit more and say, why do you believe in this stuff? It's not because of your atheism. It's actually because you're kind of subliminally channeling Christianity in the end. And none of this stuff makes any sense if there isn't a God. It's all just whistling in the wind in the end, if there's no God who can actually sustain these beliefs. It's really important.
Well, and Frank Turek said it with the Stealing from God book and the things he said there. It's like, okay, you're stealing the morality of God and using it. You're placing it over the top of your worldview. You just don't really want to change and give your life over to somebody that's going to have a moral standard for you, that person being Jesus. And so it kind of changes things. But typically when you start getting atheists, Justin, to start pulling on the thread, and this is happening seemingly faster now than it used to. It used to take them a long kind of circuitous route to get to the same place. But basically, it's chapter 7 of your book, which is the atheist's greatest objection, which is the problem of suffering or the problem of evil or any of these types of things. Colloquially, we just call it, bad things happening to good people, even though they don't like when you ask them, what do you mean by bad? What do you mean by good? And those types of things. But atheists just seem to shoot right there. Even seekers, Justin, people that are fervent seekers, right? People that are just on this faith journey, they're trying to reckon with, okay, I get it. But, a tsunami happens and it wipes out, hundreds of thousands of people. What in the world? Like, God was just sitting there during the Holocaust, like allowing that to happen. I mean, Joe Rogan has pushed back on Christians that have been on his show. It's like God was watching that and it was like, this is okay. This is good. This is part of God's will. And it's a huge stumbling block for believers and non-believers, frankly. So talk a little bit more about that, the greatest of all objections.
It is just the biggest one. It's the oldest one. The book of Job, arguably, the oldest book in the Bible. That's the foundational question. Why would God allow bad things to happen to good people? And it's not easy. And I don't want to kind of just give pat answers and pretend that there are easy answers to these things. I want to sit with those difficulties and those kind of things you just mentioned to me. And when it comes time to have the conversation with someone who's got those kinds of objections, I want to very carefully tease out perhaps not just those big issues, Holocaust, tsunamis, whatever, but maybe what's firing these questions in their own life. Because more often than not, you'll find there's some perceived injustice or tragic episode in someone's own life that has caused them to question whether there can be a good God. Okay. Now, the first thing I want to say is sometimes a kind of apologetic answer is not necessarily the first thing someone needs. Maybe they actually just need your love in that instance. They need you to get alongside them, weep with them, grieve with them. But if the time does come for kind of looking at this at a more intellectual level and trying to offer some kind of an answer to someone in that place, I would say there's a few places you can go. The first one is to say that getting rid of God does not solve the problem of evil and suffering. It just turns a mystery into meaninglessness. Okay. If you just say, well, there is no God, then all you're left with is a world in which, stuff happens and there's no rhyme or reason to it. There's no kind of purpose behind it. You're left with the world that Dawkins describes of blind, pitiless indifference. Okay. Now, maybe you'd rather have that than have God, but I don't think it's actually going to help anyone. Just simply saying it's all random, it's all pointless. It just leads to nihilism, frankly. So I would say you haven't really helped by getting rid of God at a practical level. Secondly, you still run into this problem. Without God, you can't even say that this is evil, this is wrong. It shouldn't be this way, because there is no standard of good or evil, right or wrong.
By what standard? Exactly.
Yep. You kind of need God to even make the criticism of God. Okay. And that's the irony of the whole thing. It's very difficult to escape this trap, if you like. And then I'd simply want to sit someone down and say, can you think of any instances where something bad happened to you, but actually in the long run, it turned out to be for your benefit? Okay. Where something happened that at the time seemed like a really downer, but in hindsight, I've got friends whose second child was born with Down syndrome. And that was a huge kind of thing for them. That they were not expecting that. It was a complete surprise at the point of birth. It led to a lot of difficulty in their life, frankly. Things that they had to reorganize their lives in all kinds of complicated ways to make space for this child and their special needs. But they would not swap the life they have for anything, because that child has actually brought them so much joy. They've learned so many things they could never have learned if they didn't have a child with Down syndrome. Now, that's not to take away from the real difficulties and challenges of life, but that's just one very simple example of where someone found something that was difficult, painful, actually was something they learned something from. Now, zoom out to a perspective we can never understand, but God's perspective. Isn't it just far, far, far more likely that a God who is so far beyond our understanding, our limitations, time, space itself, that God could have purposes that we simply cannot grasp, that even in the midst of the most terrible things you can see, tsunamis, Holocaust, there may still be some kind of purpose? I think we simply cannot rule God out on the basis that, well, if I was God, I would do a better job. We're not in the position of God. We've got to have some, what the philosophers call epistemic humility, okay? We cannot know that there may be some kind of circumstances that even with all the awfulness we see, God still may have a bigger purpose. Coming back down just to the kind of the everyday level of being a Christian, I'd say for me that ultimate purpose is kind of represented in the person of Jesus Christ. Because the whole story, really, the whole Christian story culminates in the death and resurrection of Jesus. And it's this idea that God turns a tragedy, the most awful, unjust event possible, the most perfect human being put to death, being humiliated, betrayed, experiencing the most awful torture. Yet somehow God redeems and restores all of that for our benefit. And my faith as a Christian is that whatever awfulness we see in the world, the person of Jesus, his example, his death and his resurrection are the kind of the lens through which we have to understand life, that somehow in his grace, God is going to redeem everything. Everything will ultimately. And that is faith. That can't, I have to be a Christian to believe that. But I think it's the only source of hope we have. And for many people, it's the only thing they can hold on to, the idea that God came and he knows what it's like to suffer because he's been there. He's walked in our shoes. He died on a cross. That is the ultimate thing I would hold out to someone who's in that place, is saying God knows what it feels like. And it may not make sense. A lot of it, it's really difficult to make sense of, but actually it's the one thing that will actually give you a hope that this crazy world could actually make sense in the end. I just think Jesus has to be at the center of any kind of apologetic like that.
Well, and sometimes you'll see left-wing atheists in the streets rioting over something, and they'll be screaming, no justice, no peace, no justice, no peace. I would actually like to co-opt that a little bit, because if a little girl is kidnapped, raped, and then murdered, and you can't find any, how could a good God allow something so heinous like that to happen? Well, in an atheistic worldview, there will be no justice for that person, and you will have no peace with what have happened. And also that little girl will also not know peace, because guess what? She was just a highly evolved chimp. that ran into the wrong chimp at the wrong time. And I was like, is that a better story? I mean, I know we're not allowed to say his name. He's like Voldemort now, but Ravi Zacharias, origin, meaning, morality, destiny. Origin, where did everything come from? Meaning, why is everything here? Morality, what's the difference between good and evil? Destiny, where do you go when you die? You're telling me that's the story you want to go with, secular atheists? Is that, hey, chimp just took out another chimp, no biggie, but I'm going to be mad about it somehow. And it does wrap up into the person and work of Jesus. And I've just been frankly shocked, and you talked about this in the book, that's why I'm bringing it up, at the number of intellectually sound people that will throw out one of literally the most ignorant comments, one of the dumbest things you could possibly say, which is like, but we don't even know that this Jesus guy was even a real person. And yet this person believes everything they read about Alexander the Great. They believe that Julius Caesar crossed the Rubicon. I'm glad you use that example in the books. I use that example all the time. It's like you believe that he crossed the Rubicon, but there's way more attestations of Jesus being a real Middle Eastern Jewish carpenter that lived and kind of had this 3-year ministry, even from people that didn't follow him. You could get it from Josephus or Tacitus or Pliny the Younger or any of these types of people attested to the fact that, yeah, this dude existed and yeah, he was killed on a Roman cross at the behest of the Jewish Sanhedrin. But help me understand the popularity of the Jesus didn't exist theory.
Yeah.
Because I feel like it's the same people that, they'll go down the multiverse track and they want to go to all these crazy places as opposed to just acknowledging, okay, this guy probably existed. Okay, he definitely existed. I just don't believe he's God and I don't want to worship him.
Yeah, I totally feel the frustration there because whenever I bump into the kind of the ultra skeptical Jesus mythicism stuff, which just floats around online, is not taken seriously in actual academic circles, but sure, nonetheless has been very influential. It's just, I just scratch my head because it's just so against the actual prevailing scholarship. And I think if I'm absolutely honest, it does come from a very subjective personal bias against Christianity. It's not hard to detect when you go to the sites where this Jesus mythicism stuff prevails. It's obviously being run by very anti-religious types. Even a kind of non-Christian Bible scholar like Bart Ehrman, who's very critical of aspects of evangelical Christianity, he wrote a whole book basically on the evidence for Jesus Christ because he was running into so much of this Jesus mythicism stuff, and he just said this is ridiculous. And when I interviewed him about it, he said it's easy to see it's coming from people who basically don't want there to be a God, don't like Christianity, so they think, well, if we can just eliminate this Jesus character, kind of job done. The problem is you can't eliminate Jesus. If you take Jesus out of the first century, there's a whole bunch of things you cannot explain, including the rise of the early church, and all kinds of other things. I really appreciated, you mentioned Wes Huff earlier on Joe Rogan. I mean, what a fantastic job he did, just of kind of opening Joe Rogan's eyes and therefore the eyes of literally millions of listeners to just the basic good provenance of the New Testament and how reliable that document is, how it just stands head and shoulders above other equivalent literature of its time, that you do not have to put your brain in the bin to be a Christian. It makes sense to believe this person, Jesus Christ of Nazareth, walked and taught. Now, the question is, we know he died. That's, again, a absolutely certain historical fact, as certain as you can be of any ancient historical fact. The question is, did he rise again? Okay. And that's kind of, for me, I devote a whole chapter to that in the book because that's an interesting question. And it raises that whole question of, well, can you talk about that as historical? Can miracles be part of history? And my view is, well, they can if they're the best explanation for the facts. And if you're kind of just at least slightly open to the possibility of the miraculous, maybe there's one particular miracle that has defined our world, that has defined the history of our world, that might just be true. And I think Jesus' resurrection is one of those examples. So for me, I'm delighted, like you, to see that Jesus mythicist stuff kind of now taking a back seat. I just haven't seen that floating around nearly as much in popular circles as it did maybe in the heyday of the New Atheists. It's so refreshing to see a Wes Huff talking on Joe Rogan, and to see some of this good scholarship finally getting into the mainstream again.
Yeah, whenever I had Wes Huff on my show after all that, I told him from the very beginning of that conversation, Joe Rogan's his posture was very different because he's been very dismissive of Christianity. He's one of those people that would just ask people, hey, do you think Jesus actually existed? Do you think Jesus was a real guy? And so he was kind of in a low-key way pushing the mythicism of this Jesus character. And again, on that particular episode, every time Wes tried to nail him down, Joe would kind of open it up to all these ethereal philosophies and things like that. But there's some things going on behind the scenes there that are very interesting. It'll be fun to see how that comes out in the future. But then you'll have people, Justin, will be, okay. Middle Eastern Jewish construction worker named Jesus from Bethlehem. Great. Okay, he existed. But let's just change him a little bit. Or in the book, you talk about how let's just reinvent Jesus and kind of make him not savior, but let's make him these other things. So I want to read a quote from the book here. Jesus is unquestionably the most influential character in history to the extent that we measure history in the epochs before and after his life. But the time gap since he lived has led to all kinds of conjecture about who he really was. Conjuring a Christ in our own image has become a common phenomenon. Believers of different stripes have variously cast him as a socialist revolutionary, a pacifist, or a Rambo figure ready for a scrap with any liberal theologian who crosses his path. And there are plenty of non-Christian interpretations out there too. And then you give a list of kind of the most common ones: Jesus the guru, Jesus the zealot, and even Jesus the husband. So this goes back to some of the, I guess you can call scholarship that undergirded Dan Brown's The Da Vinci Code and things like that, which I never really understood why people got mad at the Da Vinci Code. It's like, it's a fiction book. Like, it's not a historical document. Like, chill out, everybody. It's just for your entertainment. If it becomes your theology, then that's dangerous. But just talk to us a little bit about the reinvention of Jesus in our own image, or in an image of somebody that we can tolerate more than somebody that demands our entire life and worship.
Yeah. And I think this has been an ongoing thing. People have always been fascinated with the person of Jesus because he's been such an influential character. And so you get constant reinterpretations and dramas and things, that are trying to reimagine Jesus and so on. And the Da Vinci Code, was definitely one of those moments when a lot of people kind of, bought into this whole thing. And I think because it was sort of a crossover between fact and fiction, a lot of people
very compelling.
Got taken in, didn't they? I mean, the funny thing is, I briefly mentioned this this in the book, but the whole Jesus the husband thing that was going into that kind of had this moment in the press when this scholar called Karen King announced sort of news to the media that she had got hold of this papyrus very early that talks about Jesus having a wife and so on, that he'd been a married man. There was a whole investigation that was sort of reported in the Atlantic magazine in which it turned out she had been the victim of a huge hoax. And in fact, she had kind of announced this before it had gone proper scholarly. And it turned out this was a forgery. And it was, the problem is people kind of love to jump on these theories, and it's because they're often don't find as interesting or titillating the kind of conventional view that Jesus was who he said he was someone who led this group of people, who was, a celibate man, someone who was an itinerant rabbi, but who claimed of himself that he was the fulfillment of the promises of Israel's Messiah, who got himself crucified by the Romans, and whose followers, shortly after his death, started to claim that he had risen from the dead. That story is kind of so familiar in some ways that people kind of think, oh, well, maybe there's a more interesting version of it. But the reality is that story is the reason it's been the kind of the relatively uncontroversial Orthodox story is because it's the best attested story. It's the one that actually it's the one that the earliest manuscripts attest to. All of these other versions of Jesus tend to come from much later apocryphal gospels, written a long time from the events that they purport to be describing, by people who didn't know the characters, who weren't part of the community, and so on. And one of the most fascinating things, I talk about this in the chapter on the evidence for Jesus, is that modern scholarship just keeps putting us closer and closer in touch with the original community, friends, followers of Jesus, so that we can very confidently talk about eyewitness testimony in the Gospels. You hardly ever get that in ancient history. Most things are written many years after the events by people who weren't sort of there at the time. Whereas people like Richard Bauckham, the New Testament scholar, he's shown that when you look at the Gospels and you do a tally of the names that exist there, Mary, Martha, Lazarus, these kinds of names, and then you go and tally it against the data we have from Jewish burial sites of that era, they tally up perfectly. The kind of the how often those names appear is perfectly in line with how often we find them in the historical evidence we have. And that just goes to show this cannot have been written later. These accounts were by people who were around at the time. You don't get that detail right if you're writing these at a later time in a different place. And that's some of the most exciting things about modern scholarship. It's actually, some people think, oh, the more we know, the less reason we have to believe. It's the opposite. The more we're discovering, the more we're digging up stuff in Israel, the more that we're kind of getting our hands on all of these manuscripts, comparing them against each other, the more they say, actually, this stuff really happened. People who knew about it were writing about it at the time. It might be the nerd in me coming out, Carl, but I find that very interesting and exciting.
Well, you don't have to be a nerd to read Bockham's Jesus and the Eyewitnesses and just be absolutely gobsmacked at what you see there. Because Wes Huff said the same thing about, these other supposed gospels that, came later that were attributed to people that were there in Jesus's time, the names used there did not match with the names that were common at the time. And so, we did something funny on the forging table recently. We looked up everybody's name. Well, the name Kyle is really, really, really unpopular right now. Probably my fault. But back in the day, it was super popular. It used to be a top 10. And so if you write a modern day novel with a bunch of Kyles in it, it's going to be like, all right, that's a little bit weird. But also, we want those things to be true. It's so clear. Again, Joe Rogan, again, he wants the gospel of Judas to be true. He wants the gospel of Mary to be true. He wants the gospel of Peter to be true. He wants some of these things to be true because it's more exciting to him that's real. It's the same thing conspiracy theorists is. The conspiracy is always more exciting than the boring old truth. And sometimes conspiracies are real. But guess what? Every year that we have more archaeological data come out, the Bible would get less and less relevant if, in fact, it were true that all this was made up. But I talked to Titus Kennedy, who's a Christian archaeologist, and they're looking at different things. They just keep confirming what the Bible has said. And they just keep finding things that say, well, actually, this people group did operate in this area of the world, and they did exist, and King David was a real person, and all this stuff that we kind of get into. And it kind of lends itself to something you alluded to, I believe so earlier, the minimal facts approach, to where it's like, okay, if we can just take out some of the philosophical meanderings and just get to the minimal facts, it could help us. So I want to read from the book here. In fact, I believe that the case for the resurrection is stronger today than ever before. You just got through saying that. A new generation of biblical scholars have been examining afresh the evidence for the claim that lies at the center of the Christian faith. Leading this field are New Testament historians Gary Habermas and Michael Licona, authors of The Case for the Resurrection of Jesus, who have jointly proposed a new way of making the argument, the minimal facts approach. And then the facts that they lay out are 1, Jesus died by crucifixion. 2, the empty tomb. 3, people reportedly meeting the risen Christ. 4, the conversion of skeptics. And 5, the explosive growth of the Christian church. Now, we've kind of hit on a lot of those, at least tangentially in this conversation. But if you are a skeptic, atheist, or, a scholar or historian of some kind, those are the minimal facts that you have to dispense with, and you can't just dispense with one of them and the whole house of cards comes crumbling down. You have to find a way to dispense with all of them. And when you approach the argument that way, it becomes much more compelling. What say you?
Yeah, you put it really well. And what I often find when I'm talking, especially to non-Christian audiences, I was speaking at University College London just last week, that people are often surprised because they think of the Bible as just a theological text, a kind of religious rule book, that kind of thing. But actually, the Bible can be kind of handled in a very different way, especially the New Testament, just as a book of kind of historical documents. These are letters, these are biographies, these is wisdom literature that was written down, for a particular community at a particular time. And they are packed with historical information, and that people kind of don't realize this. You're dealing with historical gold here. And so what the minimal facts is doing is saying, look, we're not asking you to see the Bible as the inspired word of God or anything like that. Just treating it purely as a historical document, we can get a lot of information out of this that is kind of uncontroversial in historical circles. So whether you are a believing or non-believing scholar of the ancient world, here's what the majority of them agree on. And it's exactly, those are 5 facts. There are others that could be added, but those are 5 facts: that Jesus died by Roman crucifixion, that a group of his female followers discovered an empty tomb, that people claimed that they had met the risen Christ, that skeptics were converted, and the explosion of the growth of the early church. And the question is, if those are kind of relatively uncontroversial historical facts that we can just get from the data and from the extra biblical data as well, that the vast majority of historians, both Christian and non-Christian, agree on, well, what's the best explanation? And the thing is, you can try and come up with a naturalistic hypothesis. Maybe the disciples stole the body, maybe the disciples kind of made off with the body, maybe the Romans made off with the body, maybe it was hallucinations, maybe, all kinds of things. The problem is when you run them through that filter, if you like, of those minimal facts, none of them really make sense of all the evidence. The explanation that really does make sense of all the evidence happens to be the explanation that they gave at the time, that Jesus had risen from the dead. So unless you've got some kind of a priori reason to kind of discount the miraculous, then you should take that seriously, okay? You should just be willing to look at the actual explanation that was given at the time, because these people had no sort of imperative, no kind of real reason to make this up. They went on to be persecuted, beaten, and often killed because of their belief in the risen Jesus. Their Jewish theology, it was in stark contrast to this idea of a Messiah who was raised in time. The fact they had women at the tomb as the first discoverers of the empty tomb, that if you were trying to make up a story to convince people at the time, that was about the worst way you could go about doing it. So all of these things seem to suggest there's something really happened, and let's take the explanation they gave seriously, just at a historical level. And I think that just sometimes opens the door for people to realize, maybe I should actually kind of think, I shouldn't just assume these were just, peasants who just had all these crazy, fanciful religious ideas. Maybe there's something actually historical at the core of this that I need to investigate.
One that I would add to the minimal facts approach was, certainly the persecution of early Christians. But when you have his apostles, right, all of them except John and Judas, but all of them died a martyr's death. And we have no reporting whatsoever that they said, I was just kidding. We made it up. We stole the body. We buried it in another place. No one ever found it. We beat up the Roman soldiers and, it kind of just worked out to our benefit. We thought we would get, monies and honeys for doing all this. Nope. We don't see any of that anywhere. We see that these men, in a lot of cases, they welcomed the death that was coming to them. The only thing they lamented is they didn't have more time to evangelize, right? And so it's like, you got to explain that, because as people have said, a lot of people have died for lies, because people are like, no one dies for a lie. No, they die for lies all the time. What do you think of these people that are blowing themselves up with suicide vests are doing? They're dying for a lie. But you don't die for a lie that is a lie. You don't do that. That doesn't make any sense. Like, you have to be 3/4 of a fruitcake to be thinking in a way that allows you to allow yourself to be killed for something that not to be true. So we're running out of time a little bit here. So toward the end of the book, time's flown on this conversation. It's been fantastic. But you do get into deconstruction and reconstruction. So obviously I've talked to a lot of people on the show, Lisa Childers, Sean Cooper, different folks about the issues with deconstruction. And you talk about this in the book. Most of the time, deconstruction doesn't lead to reconstruction. They're not tearing down to see what's left to build up. When I go and speak someplace, Justin, this is what I tell the people before I get there. I go, just a warning, in case people don't know me, my style is burn it down and walk away. Because I don't live in, Armpit, Ohio, or whereversville, Minnesota. I get to go back home. Right? Y'all have to stay here with these people. It's my job to burn off the dead wood just so we can see what's left so that y'all can build some people up. There's probably going to be some people that come to Christ. There's going to be some people that redirect their life back towards Christ, all of that type of thing. But we don't really see that with deconstruction. People are deconstructing for the sake of deconstructing, and then they just find this kind of squishy milieu of psychological psychobabble and, moral therapeutic deism, and they just stay there. They're like, this is fine enough. And so talk to us a little bit about this process, because you go into a lot of detail in the book, so we'll leave it for people to read in the book, about these people that are deconstructing and then not doing anything with the rubble.
Yeah, absolutely. And this is kind of, a fresh chapter that I've really wanted to add into this new book, because deconstruction has been a bit of a buzzword in recent years. And there were all of those stories, a few years ago, certainly, of worship leaders and Christian leaders deconstructing, losing their faith and so on. The thing is, I guess this has always happened at some level. It may be just that we hear more about it now in the age of social media. But I think that and in a sense, it's been an ongoing thing, especially at the beginning of the turn of the 20th century. There was a real kind of liberal Protestant move to kind of deconstruct Jesus. Can we really know, etc. It's interesting when you read the biographies of, for instance, Billy Graham. He had friends in seminary who were going off in that direction, but he kind of very purposefully chose to say, no, I'm going to, despite everything I'm hearing in academia, I'm going to kind of stand on this idea that Jesus really existed and his death and resurrection really are the linchpin of history. And I think he was justified in the end for doing that, because actually the scholarship has now just completely gone against, as we were saying earlier, a lot of that kind of deconstruction, Schleiermacher kind of higher form criticism that kind of dominated the academy for a while. It's just, a lot of that's just been completely discredited now. So I think, there's a kind of intellectual grounds now for saying, actually, there's a reason why we can believe that the Christian story is true. Now, a lot of the deconstruction, though, isn't happening really in the end, I think, because of those kinds of intellectual concerns that may have kind of dominated the academy. It's more kind of people often, I think, who don't like a certain kind of cultural form of Christianity.
Right.
It might be a particularly politicized form. It might be something where it's challenging certain aspects of lifestyle that they don't want to be challenged. So there's kind of all kinds of motivations going on in that deconstruction journey. And for some people, they do go on this journey and it leaves all the pieces scattered on the floor. It literally deconstructs their faith. And what I want to say to those people is, you haven't really gained anything by just leaving everything on the floor. If all you're doing effectively is swapping one belief system for another belief system, which arguably is just as untested and unquestioned, which is just kind of liberal secularism, okay, I don't think you've really thought through what you're stepping into, because that's got all kinds of implications for it as well. And I don't think it's working out very well in the culture. I think it's important to say, look, maybe I've got questions about my faith. Maybe I do the hard work of actually then, I think, trying to reconstruct something. And I've always found that the people who really go on that journey, commit themselves to it, they can it actually is a really healthy thing. The deconstruction is often a pathway to them actually reconstructing something much more healthy, more nuanced, a stronger form of Christianity than they had before. They're unlikely to come back to the thing they left, okay? And that might be important. We all at some level kind of grow, mature in our faith. The problem is if you just smash it all up, deconstruct it and leave it there, I don't think that's a satisfactory place to end up with. And I've watched a lot of people now who kind of arguably kind of went through a very trendy deconstruction phase, maybe 5-10 years ago. And I look at where they're at now and I'm like, I don't think it's worked out very well, honestly. I don't see that this kind of life you've now embraced is actually giving, is actually fulfilling you. Maybe it's time to go back to the story. And I find a lot of people doing that now and say, maybe I need to, I've got intellectual problems, maybe it turns out I was kind of putting all the weight on the wrong thing originally. Maybe I had some very childish or sort of unbiblical version of Christianity that I was kind of being indoctrinated into, that actually I need to shed in order to get something that's more grounded in history and an intellectual thing. Maybe you've had some bad versions of Christianity foisted on you. Well, don't imagine that's all that Christianity is. Your very particular version that you were given as a child or growing up, whatever. Christianity is much bigger than that. I sometimes think it's important to take a step back and look at the way in which Christianity manifests in all kinds of different places around the world. And yet somehow it has this coherence and ability to adapt to every time and place. I just want to encourage the deconstructionists. If you're finding that the deconstruction thing isn't working out, give Christianity a second look. You might be surprised to find there's a way of putting the pieces back together. And I tell the stories of a couple of people who have done just that in the book.
When I think it's important when you're talking to somebody who's struggling with their faith or they're an atheist, it's like, hey, can you describe this God that you don't believe in? Because I may not believe in him either. Because, it's how you said, it's, the things that they're describing are probably this cultural, colloquial caricature of what God is. And, he's Zeus in the clouds throwing lightning bolts down. It's like, okay, well, I don't really believe in that guy either. So we can kind of dispense with that. And then we can kind of work our way towards truth. But Justin, we've gone everywhere in this conversation. I'm really, really thrilled with how it turned out. But that's all for me. Is there anything else you want to get off your chest?
I just want to say thank you for the conversation. If you want more from my work, my podcasts, the books, justinbrierley.com is a good place to go. But just wherever you find books, Why I'm Still a Christian, it's out now, and I hope you enjoy it.
Well, Justin, keep doing cool stuff, and we'll have you back on here. I don't even know what we'll do for a celebration for a 6th time on the show, but I guess we'll figure it out when we get there. We'll talk soon.
Awesome. Thanks, Kyle.
There you go, guys. I hope you enjoyed the 5th appearance of Justin Brierley on Undaunted.Life, a man's podcast. But before we let you go, we are going to do a quick resilience boost. At Undaunted.Life, our mission is equipping men to push back darkness with content that forges spiritual, mental, and physical resilience. 2 links for you today. I've got a link to where you can buy the copy of his new book there on Amazon, and also a link to his website. Thank you for listening to this podcast. Wherever you're listening to this, please subscribe, rate, and leave us a positive 5-star review. If you want me to come speak live at your event or on your podcast, just shoot me an email to info@undaunted.life. That's info@undaunted.life. Follow us on Instagram and like us on Facebook, and check out our website for everything else, including how to donate to keep more content like this coming your way. Just go to www.undaunted.life. And as always, we want to thank the band Holy Name for allowing us to use their music for our content. The music on this podcast is their song Perpetua, which is off their self-titled debut album on Face Down Records. The links are in the description. I'm your host, Kyle Thompson. Remember, keep pushing back darkness, keep forging spiritual, mental, and physical resilience, keep seeking the Lion of Judah.